Welcome to Grapplearts Radio.
Hello everyone, Stephan Kesting from Grapplearts.com here and the Grapplearts Radio podcast. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. It's a bit of an experiment. What I'm going to do is go through reading and interpreting and adding a little bit more to what I think is one of the most important articles on my website. And it's the article, Does MMA Make You Stupid? Impact, Concussions, and Brain Damage in Mixed Martial Arts. So I'm going to start that in just a second. Before I go on though, I just got to say, if you're into jiu-jitsu, if you're into grappling, if you're into even the martial arts, and you're not on my email mailing list, you really should be. The stuff that I put out on that email newsletter is really, really useful. There's a ton of articles, there are a ton of links, there are a ton of interesting videos, there's a ton of discussion about training and training methods and tips and how to deal with people like your instructor and the best questions you can ask them. There's a ton of stuff, and you also get to download my book, A Roadmap for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for free. This book is the best advice I can give you about how to learn Jiu-Jitsu really fast. And if you're a teacher, it might even be useful to take a look at my perspective on that, and maybe you can merge your perspective and my perspective and give your students a bit of an advantage out there and a bit of an accelerated learning curve. So you can get that 100% for free at grapplearts.com/book, grapplearts.com/book. Go there, enter your email address. You'll start getting the jiu-jitsu emails. You'll be able to download the book for free. And tell you what, if you don't like what I ever send you, if you don't like what I send you, you get pissed off at me, and you think I'm spamming you, there's an unsubscribe link at the bottom of every single email. I'd far rather not send you those emails than have you getting those emails and you not being happy with what you're getting. So with that said, let's go on and go through Does MMA Make You Stupid? Impact, Concussions, and Brain Damage in Mixed Martial Arts. And you can find that on my website, of course, grapplearts.com. MMA has been my guilty pleasure for a long time. On the one hand, I am truly a huge fan. I've watched the UFC since it started in 1993. And before that, I was watching the Gracie in Action tapes, which were basically mixed martial arts or the precursors of mixed martial arts. And I've enjoyed fights in Pride, in Shuto, WEC, Strikeforce, Bellator, and many, many other organizations. On top of that, I have good friends who are professional fighters, were professional fighters, and I've helped them prepare for their fights. So I've got nothing but respect for the athleticism, the skill, the mental toughness, and the grind that's required to become a modern MMA fighter. But at the same time, I have misgivings about the sport, and I've always had misgivings about the sport. And I think it's actually getting a bit worse now. Initially, it was kind of the seedy underbelly of the sport. When it first started, mixed martial arts and the UFC was just pilloried in the press as an underground blood sport, a fight to the death. And they really weren't that far wrong. There was a lot of blood, not very many rules, and especially the mismatches between the fighters and the brutal fights that went on a hell of a lot longer than would be allowed today. Nowadays, they would get stopped. Back in some of those early matches, the corners didn't even have the ability to stop the fight. And sometimes the fighters were too badly beaten up to tap out themselves. So there were beatings that just went on and on and on. Not really good for the sport, and certainly not good for the fighters. To make things worse, in the town that I live in, initially the only places that you could watch the fights were strip clubs, which amplified the whole sense of it being an illegal activity. I like my sex, I like my violence, but I don't like mixing the two. And just watching the fights with strippers and drug dealers and Hells Angels wannabes and a bunch of tough guys certainly didn't add to the legitimacy of the sport, and it didn't add to my own enjoyment. It made me feel kind of guilty for being there. That being said, I was completely fascinated by the sport. In the early days, events like this weren't as frequent as they are now. Now there's a fight every weekend or 2 fights a week, and if you follow more than the UFC, you can basically watch a new fight every day. So in the early days, every couple of months my friends would make our way down to some strip club in downtown Vancouver and watch the early greats, the Hoist Gracies, the Mark Colemans, the Don Frys, the Oleg Taktarovs, go into the octagon, battle, and also completely tear apart my notions of what worked in a real fight. Because of course, prior to this, I was coming from, at worst, sort of a kung fu and made up martial arts background. And at best, I was coming from martial arts that trained really hard and were semi-realistic, but the training methods weren't really all they could have been. Anyhow, I'd get so excited about these events that I'd probably not sleep for a day or two before them, and then afterwards I'd be completely screwed. I'd lie awake for hours obsessing over the matches I'd just seen, replaying what had happened in my mind, wondering what fighters should have done at certain points during the match. And eventually, what I had to actually do was I'd go to the fights. As they were almost over, or on my way home, I'd take a couple of over-the-counter sleeping pills. These usually allowed me to get to sleep, despite all the adrenaline, the vicarious adrenaline that was still coursing through my veins. Now, back in the day, it's hard to imagine this with how mainstream MMA is, but back in the day, the fact that I enjoyed MMA and the UFC shocked and appalled a lot of my more politically correct friends. They'd never seen any of the events, but they were pretty sure that the very fact that the UFC was out there was a sign of the end times. It was kind of the modern day equivalent of the gladiatorial games in ancient Rome with the Christians and the lions and mismatches and slaughter for the public to enjoy. It was part of the bread and circuses, and therefore Western society was falling. Now, when I would argue with these friends, I'd give them the party line that MMA was actually less brutal than boxing and less brutal than even football. Sure, there was lots of blood. Sure, there were broken bones and twisted limbs and dislocated joints. And the chances of orthopedic injury were fairly high. But I told myself, and of course I told anyone else who would listen, that the sport was a lot safer than boxing, at least when it came to the issue of brain trauma. Because in boxing, there were no submissions. I mean, if you don't count the no mas type events, and there was no tapping out. The boxers wore gloves, which allowed them to hit harder. That is, of course, a major misconception among the uninitiated. They think that gloves protect the fighter. And if you know anything about fighting or boxing or mixed martial arts, gloves allow you to hit harder. Just try punching a concrete wall with gloves and try punching a concrete wall without gloves and see how much longer you can hit and how much harder you can hit with gloves as opposed to without gloves. Also, in boxing, there were rounds and standing 8 counts, which essentially allowed someone on the brink of getting knocked out just enough time to recover, to go back, and then get even more beat up. So the rounds and the standing 8 counts and the gloves all meant cumulative damage. Whereas in MMA, maybe the person would get defeated by an arm lock or a leg lock or a choke or something, and they had the option of tapping out. Now, MMA has hugely matured since the early days of the UFC, which were more than 20 years ago. The rules have evolved. The referees can stop the match, and they stop them pretty quickly. And judges mean that open-ended fights that go on and on and on and on, are a thing of the past. And you got doctors, and you got athletic commissions, fighters have become respectable, and MMA has pretty much gone completely mainstream. But I'm still not comfortable, and I'm uncomfortable for a different set of reasons. I can't fully enjoy the new, improved, and sanitized spectacle of it all. It's still a guilty pleasure, and that's because of the tidal wave of evidence connecting sports with head trauma to serious, permanent, and irreversible brain damage. I mean, modern MMA, there's no way to say this nicely, is going to result in an epidemic of brain-damaged people and shattered fighters. So, let's go back in time. Let's go back and look at some of the early UFC fights. And typically those fights were very, very different from the fights you see today. First of all, the biggest difference? Fighters then didn't strike as much as they used to. Back then, a winning strategy almost always involved grappling. Whether it was ground and pound, to be fair, that's a form of striking. But there was a ton more choking, a ton more grappling, and the sort of whole trailer park crowd didn't always get the action-packed slugfests that they wanted. It was very common for booing to start as soon as it hit the ground. Now, those fights back then were sometimes bloody when someone got cut, but there was also less chance of severe and serious brain trauma. And the main reason for this was that there were no gloves, which meant that hits to the head didn't connect as hard as they do in the gloved sports such as boxing. Depending on who you listen to and what you read, when you read about the early days of bare knuckle boxing, those guys were punching each other really hard in the body, but they weren't hitting each other all that hard in the head. And that's because a professional boxer punching somebody else in the head with a bare fist is going to break a knuckle, and that means you won't be able to box. Whereas you can lay into the body pretty hard. This might help explain that whole lowered guard. You take a look at the John L. Sullivan picture, and they're almost in a karate stance with both fists up and both hands down around the waist. Well, that makes a little bit more sense when you're talking about a sport that's basically based on heavy body shots, not heavy head shots. So let's go and talk about the gloves thing. I know I mentioned it already, but it's really important to understand that fighters wear gloves to protect their hands, not their opponent's head. The knuckles of a bare fist are actually pretty fragile. It's a classic. You see some dude and his right hand is in a cast, and you ask him what happened, and usually he's going to say, oh man, I was drunk and I punched somebody, or my friends and I were fighting and I punched somebody and I broke a knuckle. Usually it's the little two knuckles of the fist, but sometimes it's the main knuckle. Bottom line, unless you're doing a ton of knuckle conditioning, you're gonna break knuckles when you punch somebody in the head. In fact, one of the best defense against somebody punching you in the head is simply to drop the top of your head a little bit, let them punch the top of your head, break their knuckles. It's gonna hurt you, but it's probably gonna hurt them more, and it's better than getting punched in the face. Anyway, I digress. So, when you take relatively fragile hands and you hand wrap the shit out of them and put gloves on them, you can punch much harder and longer. And like I said earlier, if you don't believe me, try punching a wall with a bare hand as hard as you can and see how you feel, and then try punching it with a fully wrapped hand and gloves. And I bet you'll be able to punch a lot longer and a lot more often and do more damage, well, not to the wall, but to a potential opponent with a gloved hand. So, because there weren't gloves in the early UFC, because it was really one of the only events, it meant that this whole strategy of big knockout punches was dangerous and painful, and so grappling was safer and more effective to engage an opponent. Also, the gloves make it a lot harder to control your opponent and to hunt for submissions. If you've ever grappled with gloves, and I have, it's quite a bit harder to finish the rear naked choke. Just the presence of the gloves makes it a lot harder to sneak under the chin. And if you're doing it barehanded, like the early UFC guys were, you can sneak that hand in a lot easier. So gloves sure do make grappling less effective. And then there have been a lot of rule changes and scoring changes over the years introduced to favor strikers. I mean, just think about stand-ups. When the action slows down on the ground, what happens? They get stood up. What happens at the end of a round? People get stood up. What happens to the judging? Well, judges typically give, higher marks, more points for guys who are doing a ton of striking than guys who are doing takedowns and ground control. So this has definitely increased the mass appeal of the sport. From a fan's perspective, and especially the trailer park perspective, what's more entertaining? Two guys in some technical battle on the ground where you're watching, and going, oh my God, his knee moved 1 inch here. Or two guys standing there slugging at each other, just pounding on each other until one guy gets knocked out. Obviously, the more exciting fight to watch is two guys just swinging for the fences, which would of course been impossible in the early UFC because they would have been swinging for the fences and then they would have had a broken hand. So you even see some fighters apologizing for winning their matches by submission or by ground domination and not knocking their opponent out, which I think is crazy, but they clearly know something that, they know that their odds of getting re-signed or getting a bigger bonus or getting, a title shot before their time go up if they're a really spectacular striker as opposed to a pretty good grappler. So at the end of the day, all of these changes result in fighters getting hit more often and harder in the head. So it does seem that in the current environment, there just is going to be a lot more striking and a lot more headshots than there were in the early UFC. Now, think about this. For each one time that a fighter gets hit in the head in a fight, how many times has he been hit in the head in sparring? Not all the damage comes from the fights. Every MMA fighter is doing some form of striking. And most of that, or a lot of that, means that they're doing tons and tons of rounds in the gym. It's true. Some guys have decided to not do any more kickboxing or boxing sparring. But even those guys have done their time. In fact, I think it's be almost impossible for somebody who hasn't put the time in the wars in the gym to go directly from just doing drilling to fighting at a high level in the cage. At some point in their progression, they're going to have to have been in there banging. And if they weren't doing that concussive trauma to themselves, well, they're doing the concussive trauma to other people, but other people are probably fighting back. So they're going to have taken a ton of damage in sparring. Now, it's true that people say, okay, let's just spar light. But how many times have you seen two people start out by saying, let's just go light? And before you know it, there's an all-out war and there's two people swinging for the fences. And these are a lot of the people that we admire because they've got fire, they've got passion, and they make for exciting fights. So all contact, whether it's light or heavy, whether they get it in a fight or training in the gym, it still contributes to the overall damage. So that question, or that brings us to the question of how much impact is too much impact for the brain. So of course we love it when guys go out and put on a fight of the night performance. For those of us who are sitting on our couches, in our living rooms, or as it was back in the day, in the strip club, it's exciting to have two guys swing for the fences. But all of those fights come at a real cost, and that is brain injuries that are serious, permanent, and pretty much irreversible. If I hit you in the head, or you hit me in the head hard enough, your brain bounces around inside your skull. This can injure the brain, and that injury is called a concussion. You don't need to have gotten knocked out to get a concussion. There's lots of people who are going around with minor concussions, and as we'll see, you can get concussions in soccer just from hitting the ball. All this is made worse by dehydration. Researchers in the field say that fighters who are heavily dehydrated, which is of course part of the weight cutting procedure, are more vulnerable to concussion. And I'm not a doctor, I'm not a neurologist, but it's pretty easy to see why. Your brain is floating in a bunch of fluid, and if that fluid is depleted, your brain is going to bounce harder. There are probably a whole bunch of other mechanisms at work, but impact is bad, and impact while dehydrated is worse. So, if you get a concussion, regardless of whether you got knocked out or not, you're often going to have a headache afterwards. But there are a lot of other symptoms. People talk about feeling like they're in a fog, or having mood swings, or having amnesia, or being irritable, or having slowed reaction times, which is really worrying, because if you have slowed reaction times, you're going to get hit more, which is going to result in more brain damage, which is going to result in slowed reaction times. It's a vicious cycle. Even people talk about sleep disturbance. So we talk about, getting your bell rung, and that's kind of, a funny term, but a concussion, any concussion is a brain injury. And if you look at, the Wikipedia page on concussions, they talk about them as mild traumatic brain injuries. Yes, better to get punched in the head and get a concussion than it is to have a major traumatic brain injury. That would be getting your skull split open in a car accident or having someone take a baseball bat to your head. But mild traumatic brain injuries, especially lots of them piled on top of one another, that's when we're getting into serious cumulative damage country. Now, just one concussion. Everybody's had a concussion. I think I got my first concussion, I want to say age 12. It was judo. I don't remember the throw that knocked me out. I just remember waking up and having a bunch of very concerned looking instructors standing over me. I guess I got thrown, landed on my head. That was a single concussion. Now, the symptoms from that were not permanent. I went home with a headache and it went away. But if you get hit hard enough, or you've suffered previous concussions, or let's say you just have the short straw genetically and you're particularly susceptible to concussions, then you can end up with something called post-concussion syndrome. Here's where you get all the symptoms of your concussion, the headaches, the dizziness, the sleep problems, the mood swings, but it continues for weeks or months or even years. So, I know lots of people who have some symptoms of this. I know some professional fighters who got savagely knocked out at the end of a long fight. But right after that happened, they started having severe vertigo any kind of time that they were rolling or spinning. As they were a jiu-jitsu guy too. So how often do you roll or spin in jiu-jitsu? All the time. So now you're rolling and spinning and all of a sudden you feel like the world is spinning and you have to barf. So that's pretty bad. So even years after this guy quit fighting, he couldn't do a somersault or rolling break fall without the whole world starting to go squirrely in front of him for a couple of minutes. So it may well be that this kind of cumulative brain damage is also the reason that some fighters end up getting a glass jaw late in their career. When you think of guys who were super tough in the ring, Crow Cop, Gary Goodridge, Mark Hominick, Mark Kerr, Che Congo, Dwayne Ludwig, Wanderlei Silva, Chuck Liddell. These guys could take a pounding back in the day and then still come back to win their fights. But all of a sudden, they start getting knocked out easier and easier and easier. When we take a look at some of Chuck Liddell's last appearances in the octagon, he got knocked out by a punch from a guy with a broken arm using that broken arm to knock him out. So this would have never happened early in his career. But later in the career, he certainly had a glass jaw. It could also be a sign of major cumulative brain trauma. So now, the very worst case of, not the very worst case, the worst case of brain trauma is death. But there's something that you could make an argument is almost as bad as death or worse than death, and that's a degenerative brain disease known as CTE. This has got a lot of press recently with movies about football, but CTE stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So it's a newer, fancier name for what we used to call being punch drunk. You watch footage of boxers early in their career, and they're talking, and they're articulate, and they're making sense, and then you watch videos from them later in their career, and they bloody sound drunk. What that is the cumulative effects of getting punched in the head so many times during their fights and during their training. Basically, CTE looks a lot like Alzheimer's disease. But you know what the kicker is? You can't actually definitively diagnose it except during an autopsy. And if you go out and you do a look for CTE autopsy results, there are some pretty scary images out there showing football player brains compared to regular brains. And I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a brain scientologist, but if you take a look at that brain, you as a layman, me as a layman, and compare it to a normal brain, there's no question how much damage has been done to that brain. Now the problem is, there isn't some kind of magic formula that says well, Johnny, you can get hit 1,800 times in the head lightly, or 25 times in the head really hard, and on that 26th time, you're going to start getting brain damage. Sometimes, all it takes is one really hard hit to the head for it to occur. Normally, it occurs slowly over time, but you can never underestimate, what one more shot is going to do, or draw a hard line in the sand going, I'm going to go right to the limit, and then one step before I get CTE, I'm going to draw a line in the sand and retire. If only it worked that way. That's like saying, I'm going to drink and drive. I'm going to drink and I'm going to drive home. Well, I was safe at, 0.05. Now I'm going to drive home at double that, 0.1. Oh, I still was safe. Now I'm going to double that, to 0.2, and then you crash and die. Well, it's a little bit too late to have found out what your limit was. for drinking and driving. And, you never know where that line was except in retrospect. So I said that I used to be able to defend MMA over boxing. And there are some studies out there that suggest that MMA injuries tend to have more bruises, more contusions, and less brain injuries than boxing. And some people are going to point to those studies and say that this means that MMA is safer than boxing. But that study that I'm referring to, the data was gathered right after the fight in like post-fight medical examinations. So it's short-term data. They didn't look at the long-term effects of competition and training. And we already know that it takes years and decades for the effects of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, to become apparent. There just aren't a lot of big studies yet looking at the long-term brain damage in MMA. Look how hard the NFL tried to hide the studies studying the same thing in football players. So MMA hasn't been around long enough for there to be definitive data. But there's a ton of scary anecdotes, and there's studies, and there's evidence from other sports. So a lot of the research has been done on boxing. And even the general public knows that boxing probably isn't good for your brain. Retired boxers slurring their words and being unable to remember what they had for breakfast are pretty common, and I think that kind of knowledge has trickled down. So other sports have been studied too, some that might surprise you. Football, hockey, and soccer. Any impact is impact. It doesn't matter if the shot to the head came from a fist in a glove, the helmet is some gigantic defensive tackle in the NFL, or even a soccer ball. So science can tell you that CTE is caused by these things, but it's not really very good at telling you at what point it begins to develop. So, like I said earlier, knowing when to call it off is almost impossible. So there's some studies out there looking at boxers and MMA fighters, and they take a look at how long people have been fighting and how their memory and their thinking abilities have been affected. So the brains, generally speaking, of fighters who've been fighting for more than 6 years actually get smaller. Now, it's not all about brain size. It's about what those brains can do. But it's pretty scary to think that people who've been fighting for more than 6 years, their brains actually end up shrinking. And so then, in that same study by a guy called Dr. Bernick, they found that fighters who've been fighting for more than 9 years actually start having declining performance on thinking and memory tests. So if you take a look at it, brain starts shrinking after 6 years, signs start manifesting after 9 years. What that tells you is that part of the damage starts occurring before the symptoms appear. So if you're looking for symptoms, if you're like, well, I'll know, or my family will know, or my wife will know, or my mom will tell me when I start acting weird, well, that might already be after the damage has started happening. So here's another scary thing. In case you're not already scared enough, here's another scary thing. Now, you might be thinking that maybe these guys who got damaged and had shrinking brains and declining cognitive ability, maybe they just had a really bad beating at some point in their career, or maybe they got clubbed in the head with a powerful shin kick at some point and that did the damage. Scary thing is that even light shots to the head can have cumulative damage if there are enough of them. There are even studies out there showing that heading a soccer ball can cause your memory and your mental processing speed to go downhill. Now, when you think of, you head a soccer ball, there aren't very many people who get knocked out by heading a soccer ball. So, if that was, then less people would play soccer. But it's still a shot to the head. So it just adds up. Even like heading a soccer ball more than, what they do is they take a look at players who head soccer balls more often versus players who use their feet more often. And the guys who are known for heading have got reduced cognitive ability. And so then there are other studies that look at boxers that say, what's even more important than getting knocked out in competition? It's how much sparring you're doing. So it's not, Joe got knocked out 4 times in 25 bouts. It's that Joe put in way more sparring than the other guy. So it's the repetitive subconcussive, meaning you don't actually have a full-on concussion head trauma. that reduces brain function. So this repetitive subconcussive head trauma, which happens every time you do kickboxing or boxing sparring, takes its toll. Now, obviously it's better if you're going to spar, and at some level you have to, and I've done a lot of sparring in the past, I'm more or less fine. Obviously it's better to have sparring partners who don't try and knock you out every time that you fight, but that might not be enough. Now, when you look at the statistics from football, it's just crazy. Basically, every game, you've got giant brain rattling going on, right? Helmets probably make the problems worse because they're being used as weapons. So you're slamming your brain into somebody else's brain at 20 kilometers an hour as hard as you can. And it seems from most of the studies that are going on that most professional CFL and NFL football players are retiring with some kind of brain damage. I think the awareness is there in football more so than MMA. It's entirely possible that in the future there are going to be the same kind of lawsuits filed against the UFC, against Dana White, against the other MMA organizations that have now been filed against the NFL. And some of those have been for giant settlements. We're talking almost $1 billion. So let's take a look at some fighters, right? Like I said, it's really scary to go watch guys at the beginning of their career versus the end of the career in boxing. Same thing is beginning to happen in MMA. The prime example of this is Gary Big Daddy Goodridge. I remember him in the early UFCs and he was so exciting. Man, he had some vicious knockouts. And then he moved over to Pride and kind of became the gatekeeper there. If you could beat Gary, then you could go on and get the big fights. Basically, it meant that Gary beat up the guys who weren't very good and got really badly beat up by the guys who were good enough. He kept on fighting, and finally, towards the end of his career, probably with no other ways to pay the bills, he was fighting in Eastern Europe for peanuts, probably. So he had 85 MMA fights and 38 kickboxing fights. He was knocked out a total of 36 times. That's a ton of damage. Of course, that isn't even including the damage he took in sparring. He's not an old man, but he's taking lots of medication every day, essentially for Alzheimer's patients, just to get through the day. The scary thing is, as I've said before, you just don't know where that damage point is, and of course it's gradual. It's like the whole boiled frog thing, right? You know that analogy. Throw a frog into boiling water or hot water, it jumps out. It doesn't like being in hot water. Throw a frog into cold water and gradually heat it, it doesn't realize that the water's getting hotter and hotter, and it doesn't jump out and it gets boiled. Brain damage from combat sports, probably the same way. I mean, if you went sparring one night, got hit in the head really hard, and the next day spent the day drooling, unable to stand up, and for a month couldn't remember your phone number, well, you might decide that that's it. Let's not do it anymore. We're done. However, if it's cumulative, a year later, you start having some brain farts. 2 years later, you're starting to get grumpy. 3 years later, you're starting to have sleep problems. There are a lot of other things that those symptoms could be caused by. And let's not lie to ourselves. Fighters have got a vested interest in it not being, CTE. They don't want to admit that their sport that they spent so much time developing, that the way that they pay the bills could be causing a problem, right? Nobody wants to, admit the truth until you hit rock bottom. But unfortunately, hitting rock bottom with something cumulative and irreversible is a problem, right? You don't get better from it. And it doesn't really look like science is on the brink of making any kind of breakthroughs with Alzheimer's or CTE or any of the degenerative brain diseases anytime soon. So earlier I mentioned Chuck Liddell. In one of his last fights, Rich Franklin knocked him out with a punch from a broken arm. Earlier in his career, Chuck Liddell could take a licking and keep on ticking. At the end of his career, he gets knocked out with a punch from a broken arm. But it's not just a glass jaw. That glass jaw is just the tip of the iceberg. What we're going to have to do, or what we're going to have to wait for, really, will be autopsies of the brains of former MMA fighters. We are going to see that at some point. Some MMA fighter who's experiencing a ton of problems neurologically is going to will his brain to science. They'll cut it up, they'll open his brain pan, they'll slice his brain, they'll stain it, and it'll look just like a football player's brain. Now, I've been around the sport a long time, and there's nothing sadder than a fighter who used to be really good. He had his day in the sun, but he's past his prime now. Translation, he's slowing down. Maybe that's because of the brain damage. There for sure is brain damage if he's a fighter. But he just can't quit the sport. I've known quite a few fighters who lost the desire to train. They said stuff like, when I was a young guy coming up, I wanted to train every day. I wanted to train 2 or 3 times a day. And I could not understand those guys who would only go and train before a fight. But now I'm one of them. So they lose the desire to train, but they keep on fighting in smaller and smaller shows, getting knocked out more and more often for smaller and smaller paychecks. Partially, this is because nobody wants to retire on a loss. Fighters fantasize about getting a couple of big wins in and then retiring on their own terms. But that's unlikely to happen. Honestly, you're not probably going to have a big win at the end of your career. And honestly, the main thing that keeps fighters who were once really good competing long after they should have quit is financial need. They've spent 20 years in the gym developing their grappling, their wrestling, their striking, and everyone else around them, all their peers from high school, were hopefully developing their business and career skills. So now, 20 years down the road, they've got an awesome double leg takedown. They can, jab, cross, hook, shoot like nobody's business, but they don't have other ways to make money. They probably don't even understand the financial parts or the marketing parts of running a school. They have no exit strategy. The bills keep on piling up, and they start going, this promoter's offering me $3,000 to get back into the ring. And how long would I need to work as a Walmart greeter to make $3,000 cash? Answer, a bloody long time. So, you know what? I'll just saddle up. Maybe I'll get lucky. But even if I don't, he's probably not going to hurt me. Man, I've been through a lot. So I'll just fight in this crappy little event for a couple of $1,000s. And then what it typically takes is a whole bunch of losses, health issues beginning to pile up, and ultimately orthopedic injuries that just can't be worked around. If you can't bounce up and down, if you can't throw a punch with your shoulder, then probably you're not going to fight anymore. And eventually these guys hang up their gloves for good. And what's really sad is you usually take a lot more damage when you lose than when you win. Usually, if you and I fight, and you beat and we know the result, which is you beat the crap out of me, and we had a guess on who took more brain damage in that fight, smart money's on me. Sure, there's a chance that you beat the crap out of me and I came back and I choked you or leg locked you or arm locked you and I won. That happens. Most of the time, the loser takes the lion's share of the damage. So all those losses late in a fighter's career might have a non-linear amount of damage associated with them. They might be getting even more damage towards the end of their career. Now, yes, there's brain damage, and we've talked about the overall explicit signs of brain damage: loss of memory, irritability, headaches, grumpiness, all that sort of stuff. But when you take a look at those NFL guys who've committed suicide or committed murder-suicides, oftentimes their family's pretty sure that it was brought on by brain injuries that they received while playing. You can't prove it. All you know is dude played football, dude had CTE, dude killed himself, and a bunch of other people. And again, there's no real data on whether MMA fighters are more depressed than the average human being. I mean, for one thing, MMA fighters are not average human beings. They are quite a different breed of people. But anecdotally, having known a bunch of them progress through their career, I think there's a pretty good argument for saying that untreated brain damage, because there is no real treatment for it, that brain damage can often lead to depression in MMA fighters and possibly even suicide. So there are so many factors here. It's really tough to parse this one out. I mean, for a while, these guys are the biggest, baddest, toughest guys in the ring. Or maybe they're not even the biggest, baddest, toughest guys in the ring, but they're the biggest, baddest, toughest guys at their gym or at the nightclub. And they get all the girls because, like, Jim Bob over there fights MMA and he's wearing an affliction shirt and he's got bad ears. So they're on top of the world. Later, when they stop fighting, they stop training, they start getting the adrenaline hit and the testosterone hit, and God knows what kind of steroids they've had to come off, but that's a whole nother story. They're also dealing with cumulative brain damage. I think it's entirely possible that there could be a higher incidence of suicide and depression linked to CTE. And there's also evidence, there's some evidence here. There is evidence connecting brain trauma with a decrease in your body's ability to produce testosterone. And testosterone, for a lot of people, is pretty much a happy drug. You know, you're a guy and your testosterone production collapses, you're probably going to be dealing with depression. I'm not an endocrinologist. In addition to not being a neurologist, I'm also not an endocrinologist, but that's my 2 cents worth of interpretation. What a lot of fighters do when they start getting this testosterone drop, they start turning to things like steroids and testosterone replacement therapy and growth hormone and a whole bunch of other chemicals, all hoping to, get the edge back, to get bigger, faster, stronger, and maybe win their next fight. And hey, the other guys are doing it. But now you're taking a witch's brew of artificial hormones, not very many of which have been studied for nearly long enough, and they haven't been studied in conjunction with brain trauma. They're psychoactive substances. People have roid rage, that's for a reason. People have roid rage because testosterone and testosterone analogs, steroids, are psychoactive substances. So now you're taking psychoactive synthetic chemicals and you're mixing them with a guy whose brain is already damaged. Well, it's probably not a good thing. So what's the solution? I kind of feel under pressure to wrap things up with a feel-good message. I'd love to be able to absolve all those MMA fans, and I'm an MMA fan, who, like me, have mixed feelings about supporting the sport, with our dollars and with our views and with our eyeballs and with our applause. And I'd like to be able to give some advice to fighters who are duking it out, or training essentially for our enjoyment. But it's really tough. There's not much indication that sport of MMA is going backwards and that it's going to become less violent or start focusing more on grappling. Right now, what sells is heavy impact. It's two guys slugging it out. It sells for a reason, and the cost to the fighter's brains isn't really factored into it. So what needs to happen, maybe, is that fighters, coaches, and training partners need to become hyper-aware of the danger of repeated concussions. Now, the problem here is that the nature of the sport means that you actually need to learn to take a good hit and keep going. And it's probably not a bad life lesson either. So on the one hand, you have the need to develop or prove your toughness. On the other hand, you got to balance that against brain damage. Like I said earlier, some fighters who did a ton of sparring earlier in their careers and then a ton of competing have now completely stopped sparring. But I don't know if that would work for a brand new guy. The proof will be in the pudding. Maybe someday somebody will come and win the UFC middleweight championship who's never done any sparring outside the cage. But that hasn't happened yet. Incidentally, when I first started hearing, when I was a young martial artist and I heard about Thai boxing, one of the things I heard about Thai boxers is that many of them hardly do any sparring because they're fighting almost every weekend. And if they're fighting almost every weekend, they're going to be taking damage. So they practice on the pads and they kind of use the fights like sparring sessions. Maybe that's the way we've got to go. But there aren't that many MMA guys who are fighting every weekend. And if they are fighting every weekend, they don't have a very long lifespan. So if you're a coach, you got to know your fighter. You got to keep an eye out for changes that might indicate a concussion. Hopefully you can tell. The trouble, of course, is that the science tells us that brain damage occurs years before the outward symptoms of brain damage first show up. So if you're a coach, if you're a fighter, I think you really got to pay attention to your defensive skills. Do less sparring and more drilling. Don't go full force with your sparring. Ultimately, it's the coach who's got to step in there and go, hey, guys, knock it off. Or, okay, guys, you're done for the day. When you see two guys being to ramp it up. Unfortunately, having watched coaches in action, they kind of think it's funny when two bozos are going at it, swinging for the fences, right? There's a macho attitude. And that's a real problem. And I think we have to change this attitude towards sparring. Other things you can do is after you take a heavy shot to the head, the worst thing you can do is take another shot to the head. So if you have a concussion, especially if you got knocked out, but even if you just have the self-awareness to say, man, I got my bell rung last night, to take some time off and let it heal. A lot of people get seriously hurt if they compound concussions. They take one concussion and they play injured, or they fight injured, or they train injured and they take another concussion. Now that's quite serious. I remember the first guy to die in MMA, I think it was in the Ukraine, had been knocked out the week before he fought. So by definition, he had a concussion and he was competing again and he died of brain trauma. So who knows whether or not he would have not died if that first trauma hadn't been there, but I bet it didn't help. Another thing you can do is strengthen your neck muscles and your trapezius muscles. It'll stop your head from bouncing around so much. The guys who are hard to knock out usually have got tree trunk necks. And so that might help a little bit. So what about the recreational guys? And here I'm conflicted because as a younger martial artist, I did enjoy full contact sparring. I think I got a lot out of it. I think it made me tougher. I think it taught me how to take a punch. Hopefully, those lessons have somewhat stayed with me. Hopefully, I've learned that getting hit in the head isn't the end of the world. So I think it's a spice you got to use in real small quantities. You know, if you get hit, how many times do you have to get hit in the head to know that you can take a shot? Probably more than once, but probably less than 100. So I think you have to use it in very small quantities if you're going to be smart about it. So the good news is it's not all doom and gloom. I get it. People like to push themselves. People like to see if they're up to the task. People like to prepare themselves. People like the challenge. And sometimes people actually like getting punched in the face. But you know what? You can get almost all those benefits by focusing on grappling. If you do mostly jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu or submission grappling, then it's still a great workout. It's very competitive, and the odds of getting traumatic brain injury are very much less. You get something that's very, very applicable to self-defense, and you can get that sort of one-on-one simulated fight to the death thing going just without taking the brain damage. This probably won't work if you're a professional boxer or an MMA fighter. But if you're a recreationalist, a hobbyist, a guy who just likes to train martial arts, then you can probably get most of the benefits by doing hard jiu-jitsu, hard submission grappling, but limiting your sparring, hard sparring to a couple of times a year. And you'll get most of the benefits. You will not become as good a striker as the guy who's in there banging every day, for sure. But will you be able to handle yourself in the street? Will you learn the basics? For sure, especially if you're doing the drilling and then putting those drills into action in the occasional sparring. Now, there are lots of fighters who have stopped sparring, so they can do it. Maybe you should consider doing it. You know, why are you doing something that many professional fighters have decided is too dangerous to do? You're probably not getting $5 million for stepping into the ring. You know, if you're work at an office, if you pump gas, if you're a Walmart greeter, if you're a lawyer, whatever, you're not getting paid $5 million for risking your brain at the club after work. So why are you doing it? If professional MMA fighters like Matt Danzig and other guys have decided this is too dangerous. Why are you doing it? So all these brain-friendly options are only going to work if you've got a reasonably level-headed, sane, non-testosterone-soaked instructor and training partners who can check their egos at the door. If you're at a club where everyone's on the sauce and everyone's running around without their shirts on, covered in tattoos, and just banging away, there are going to be some tough guys there, but a concussion is a foregone conclusion. It's really only a matter of time. Now, let's not even talk about kids' MMA. I think it's insane. I think it's absolutely insane to mix potential brain trauma with the brains of kids who are developing at an extraordinary rate. When you think of how much kids change between, say, age 5 and age 15, it's insane. It's so crazy how much those brains are developing. And now you're going to potentially get those neurons that are trying to make connections with each other or, die out selectively or rewire themselves. You're going to mix pounding and smashing into that. I will do everything I can to prevent my own kids, me, a hardcore MMA fan, hardcore jiu-jitsu fan, I've trained in both, from fighting in MMA, for that matter, for doing football or boxing. And I wouldn't be wild if they were doing lots of soccer either, especially if they were focusing on heading the ball. Look, the brain has got 100 billion neurons. Little cells in the brain, 100 billion neurons. If you take a look at them, they've got little dendrites that go on, that connect to other brain cells. There are 1,000 trillion connections, 1,000 trillion connections between those neurons in your head. It is the most complex object that we know of in the entire universe. Now, you'd probably be pissed if I took your computer and dropped it onto a concrete floor. Or if I took your Rolex watch and used it as a hammer to drive a nail into a board. Complex objects are often fragile. So if the 3-pound brain between your ears, the soft, squishy brain, is the most complex object in the known universe with 1,000 trillion connections between those cells, then shouldn't you be at least a little bit worried about somebody hitting you in the head repeatedly as hard as they can? I think you should be. I wish I had a better, feel-good message for you, but I feel guilty about the MMA that I watch, and I don't think that training in the striking arts is really a very good idea. Fortunately, there are alternatives. Those alternatives are called grappling. And for the vast majority of people, you can get almost as much benefit out of hardcore grappling than you can out of hardcore MMA, kickboxing, and boxing. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you on the next podcast.